This is Sheriff Bob Broadus, and you're watching Grassroots Television.
Oh, hey Bob, this is nice. You're pretty good at drawing a crowd.
Well, this is an impressive crowd. My first time in Aspen. I thank everybody for such a nice welcome.
Well, it's our pleasure to have the Honorable Barack Obama, who, as you know, was sworn in.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, guys.
Sworn in as a senator from Illinois earlier this year, a graduate of Columbia University, the Harvard Law School, first African-American editor of the Harvard Law Review, a community organizer. But you know what? That doesn't even come close to talking about your life story. I mean, his life story, as those of you who have read this book, Dreams from My Father, know, his life story is what July 4th weekend is all about. It's a life story that inspires us with the ideals of America and, of course, that greatest sentence in any great declaration ever written about freedom. That was exactly, this is the exact anniversary, meaning they actually did it on July 2nd, and then they signed it July 4th. But that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. So let me ask you a biographical question first, which is, how did a skinny black guy with a funny name, born in Hawaii, of a mother from Kansas and a father from Kenya, become a senator from Illinois?
Well, there are a lot of people who are still trying to figure it out, including myself. I just recently wrote an opinion piece in Time magazine because they're commemorating Abraham Lincoln. And I mentioned that the only thing less likely than me becoming a U.S. Senator was Abraham Lincoln becoming our greatest president. But it's a testimony, I think, to what's possible in this country. I moved to Illinois after college because I was interested in working as a community organizer. And there were a group of churches out in the far south side of Chicago that were struggling with the devastation of steel plants that had closed. The entire Rust Belt ran through the Chicago region. And communities had been devastated. People had been laid off. Parishes had been destroyed. Commercial strips had been abandoned. And so these churches were trying to regroup and figure out how to patch neighborhoods back together again. And so I moved there not knowing what to expect. I didn't know a soul in Illinois. And it turned out to be the greatest education I ever received. We worked to help set up job training programs for the unemployed. We worked to improve the schools in the area, bring more city services and infrastructure improvements. But most important, what it taught me was that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they're given the opportunity and they're working together. And it was that formative experience of working in those neighborhoods that sparked my long-term interest in politics. And so I knew going to law school that I probably wouldn't end up being a long-term practicing lawyer. I worked as a civil rights attorney, ended up teaching at the University of Chicago at the law school there, and then served in the state legislature when it came up.
You know, in your book, you talk a lot about race and your growing awareness of race in your life, including even stories about your father, who I think left Hawaii when you were 2, but you used to gather stories about him and how he dealt with race in America. Tell me about your growing awareness of race and where you see it going now.
Well, you know, if you look at my family or photographs of my family, we're sort of a walking United Nations. I've got a sister who's half Indonesian. I have, she's married to a Chinese Canadian.
The Canadian part is
yeah,
what's
the Canadian part's
people. Yeah.
disturbing to folks. Yeah, I know. But they do walk among us, these Canadians. You can't always tell them. You can't always spot them. You know, fortunately, because I was born in Hawaii, although it's not the racial paradise that I think is sometimes portrayed, it's not a perfect melting pot, but it's about as close as it comes in the United States, particularly in the early 60s. I was born in 1961. At the time, my parents' marriage would have been illegal in a large number of southern states. It wasn't until 1967 that the Supreme Court ruled in Loving versus Virginia that a state couldn't prohibit a black and a white from marrying. But in Hawaii, it was an enclave that was separate and apart from what was taking place on the mainland United States. And so that gave me a sense of protection. I moved to Indonesia when I was young because my mother, I guess not having disturbed her parents enough by marrying a Kenyan, after divorcing him, remarried an Indonesian. And so we lived in Jakarta for 4 years. And again, that meant that I was insulated from some of the most tumultuous times of
kind of
the
reminds
1960s.
me in a way like Helen Keller, who didn't learn language until late, so learned it with a different consciousness. You learned race late.
Yeah, a different sense of well, let me put it this way. I think the starting premise for me that my mother instilled in me, and my father even indirectly instilled as well, was that everybody was the same. But also that people occupied different circumstances as a consequence of history, as a consequence of injustice. And so although all people were the same under the skin, it didn't mean that different people didn't have different circumstances and you didn't have to stand up on behalf of those who were vulnerable or weak or being oppressed. I became most conscious of that actually around issues of class, because when I was in Indonesia, like many third world countries at the time, huge gulfs between rich and poor. And so I think my sense of the unfairness of life and that people could be cruel to each other was understood more in class terms than it was in race terms.
You know, you entitled your book Dreams from My Father, and yet you barely knew him in a way. Why was it called Dreams from My Father?
You know, for those who don't know my background, my father left when I was 2, and so I only met him once when I was 10 years old. And
he was a tribal leader on the shores of Lake Victoria, if I remember, in Kenya.
In Kenya, he was part of that first generation of African students who had come to study.
And he studied for a doctorate at Harvard, right?
He ended up studying for a doctorate at Harvard, went back to Kenya, and I think represented all the optimism of the liberation movements in a lot of developing countries right at the moment of independence, and then experienced some of the disappointments of the post-independence era. He experienced the corruption and nepotism and spoke out, ended up being blacklisted by the government in Kenya, and ended up having a difficult time and died a bitter man, a sad figure. But because I didn't know him, I think that, and this is true for maybe a lot of people, certainly true for a lot of African American youth, they understand their fathers as sort of a distant figure. One of the advantages I had, though, was that my mother still saw him and painted him in mythical terms. She, despite the differences they had with each other, still loved each other, and so she created this mythic figure. He was the smartest man in the world and the most honest man in the world, and the most concerned with issues of social justice. And so I had this image of him that ended up shaping my childhood. And it wasn't until I got out of high school and went to college that I realized that I had been shaped by this ghost, by this myth, and that I needed to understand exactly who he was so that I would understand who I was. And so the book chronicles, I think, that part of my life where I'm still trying to figure out who I am and who he is and how our stories connect. And it ends in Kenya and a recognition that some of the struggles he went through in post-colonial Africa are not that different. In fact, are connected with some of the struggles that people, immigrants and African Americans and all people go through here in America.
Yeah, you know, there's sort of a line when you talk about whether it's Plymouth Rock or Ellis Island or Gorée Island and off Senegal, we all are facing that same tragedy and struggle.
Well, you know, one of the wonderful things about America is that we come from these different ports and these different places, and there is this sense that we can create ourselves, that our destiny isn't determined by somebody else, but it's determined by us, and our individual initiative and will and luck. And that's always been one of the unique qualities about America and one of the precious qualities about America. Now, that myth can be overstated and sometimes distorted or twisted in such a way where people have the impression that this country's been built only on an individual initiative and not on us working together as a community. It sometimes ignores structural problems in terms of issues like race or class that are deeply embedded. But the basic ideal that we can remake ourselves is, I think, something that has appealed to immigrants from Europe, from Africa, from Asia. It moves us still. It still motivates us, and I think it's something that is worth holding on to.
You know, last year on this stage right now, we had Sandra Day O'Connor for Justice. And I think I speak for a lot of people in saying there's a sense of loss that she decided to step down from the court. How high is the bar going to be for you in terms of whether or not you would filibuster a nominee based on ideological reasons?
Well, I have told my Democratic colleagues that there's one way to prevent judges that we don't like, and that's to win elections. So, the strategy of filibuster or other parliamentary or procedural rules can delay and slow down a process, but it can't stop it. And my estimation would be that there's a decision that has to be made by the White House as to whether they're looking for a less controversial candidate that can generate at least some bipartisan consensus, or they want to send a strong signal to their religious right constituency that will involve a lot more controversy. I suspect that they've boxed themselves in, and it will probably be the latter. That you probably won't see. People are very afraid, I think, in certain segments of the Republican Party that another Kennedy or O'Connor or Souter will be nominated. And the more explicitly ideological the nominee is, the more likely that Democrats will try to stop it.
Let me let you take off your Senate hat for a moment, because you teach constitutional law at the University of Chicago. Do you think it's right for the Senate to block a nomination based on ideological reasons?
I think there is nothing. I would distinguish between conservatives and or liberals who reflect a certain political direction that the country is moving in. I think it's appropriate to vote against somebody who you don't agree with, but I'm not sure it's appropriate to filibuster somebody just because they don't adhere to every aspect of judicial philosophy that you believe in. I would say that there are circumstances in which a filibuster is appropriate if somebody is so far out of the mainstream that they are looking to radically rework our broad consensus about how the courts should function. If you have a judge who says, I think we should overthrow the entire New Deal and go back to the Lochner era when basic regulation, basic zoning powers, environmental laws, etc., child labor laws were considered unconstitutional encroachments on private property. That's a radical step, and that's not what I think most people sign up for when they were voting for president. They didn't expect that you would dismantle the New Deal. And in that circumstance, I think a filibuster might be appropriate. But I don't expect that George Bush is going to appoint the same person that I would appoint, or Bill Clinton would appoint. And that means that there's room, there's space to find candidates for the court who I disagree with, I might even vote against, but I would consider inappropriate subjects of filibuster.
If your party filibusters, do you just assume you'll lose the right of filibuster?
Yes.
In terms of a... Go ahead, explain.
For those of you who have been following this, you saw that this nuclear option was averted at the last minute by 14 senators who said that we shouldn't destroy the possibility of filibustering judges. But I don't think that center will hold if you have a big ideological battle around the Supreme Court. I think that the
So you'll lose the filibuster if you filibuster?
If we filibuster, I think the nuclear option, which would eliminate the filibuster, will be triggered, and I suspect that the Republicans will be able to get their nominee, regardless of the filibuster. Now, that I think is upsetting to a lot of folks, and I may be wrong. It's possible that the 6 Republicans who agreed to avert the so-called nuclear option remain steadfast, but I think they will be under tremendous pressure within their own party, and I'd be surprised if they can withstand that pressure. Again, my biggest hope is that the White House steps back and recognizes that they are representing the entire country, and that particularly for the Supreme Court, that we want somebody who can build a broad enough consensus as part of a court majority that the American people feel their views are represented and that they are part and parcel of the judicial decision-making process.
Do you have any suggestions who he...
I suspect Karl Rove and George Bush will not follow whatever suggestions I have. So.
All right.
It's not a list I've spent a lot of time developing.
You haven't phoned it. Yeah. Actually, I noticed that he did ask Senator Leahy and Senator Reid of the Democratic Party, as well as Arlen Specter and I guess Bill Frist, to meet with him on July 11th, which is a good sign.
That is a good sign.
I mean, that's the advise and consent.
Well, this has been the tradition, and historically, what the American, what a president would do is he'd generate a list, and then he'd put it before the leaders of both parties.
It was good for us in the press because everybody would leak it, and so we'd have a lot of stories. And
but as a consequence, you obtained a sense of stability of the process, and I think ultimately it made the judges more effective.
Why is there no longer that cross-party comity that you used to have? Why have we gotten so partisan? Because you kind of fought against that in your race.
Well, first of all, I mean, Walter, you're enough of a historian to know that there have been some pretty ugly battles in American history. Sometimes we have this nostalgia for this golden age, and anybody who thinks it was all peaches and cream should read some of the press reports about President Lincoln. Yeah. And the names they were calling him. It would even make Roger Ailes blush, seeing some of the names they called him at that time. But I do think that we have a tendency, an unwillingness to disagree without being disagreeable, an inability to think practically about problems without exploding in ideological warfare, that at least in my lifetime, seems much more extreme. And I think that part of it has to do with the lack of a strong consensus around some very critical issues. The global economy, I think, is an issue that parties have very different visions about. I think the Republican Party right now, they call it the ownership society, but I think the basic vision is one of a stripped down government, and we're going to simply refund everybody as much money as possible, and then you're on your own. And that an unfettered free market is always going to be superior, and the more unfettered it is, the better it is. The Democrats have a different vision. I think on social issues, we've got some very legitimate, difficult issues that we're confronted. Abortion is an issue that is very difficult to compromise on because people feel very deeply about these issues. And if you believe that abortion is murder, then it's hard to say, well, I'll admit murder in some circumstances. You feel that you have to go all the way and fight as hard as you can. And so there are a set of issues that I think are difficult. But the one other thing that I've noticed in Washington is the degree to which the media, blogs, the internet, what are called astroturf groups, which are essentially groups that are fabricated,
Fake grassroots.
Fake grassroots groups that are generating emails and phone calls. Those are so well coordinated and so focused that it pushes both sides in their most extreme corners.
And same with congressional redistricting, too.
Congressional redistricting is a classic example. I think that one of the worst things that's happened in Congress is the fact that we have districts that are so gerrymandered that the average Republican or the average Democrat never has to appeal to the other party. And so you have a variety of these forces at work that have resulted in a lack of deliberation, a lack of conversation, and a reinforcement of a single worldview. The NPR listener is not talking to the Fox News watcher. And if you have an entirely different world, if you're getting entirely different information, here's a great example. One of my favorite examples just recently. We had the dust-up around Guantanamo. And you will recall that Newsweek got hammered because it turned out that the report that the Quran had been flushed down the toilet on Guantanamo was unsubstantiated. And Newsweek had to jump through a lot of hoops. About 3 weeks later, the Pentagon issues a report indicating that, in fact, although the Quran was not flushed down the toilet, it was urinated on, and curse words were written in the Quran. And I remember I was watching Fox News. I was on the treadmill, and I saw the snail go by, and the tracking news at the
Crawl,
bottom.
we
The
used to
crawl.
call it, yeah.
Right. Snail, crawl, whatever, something. And at the bottom it says, Pentagon report confirms that Quran was not flushed down the toilet. Right? I mean, that was the news flash. And I'm not picking on Fox News.
Feel free.
But, you know. But if that's the information you're getting, then you are going to be deeply offended by people who, suggest that somehow the things that are going on in Guantanamo are illegitimate.
We used to have a common ground of information a common ground in which our congressmen or congresswomen would have to appeal to because they were not gerrymandered districts. And even just a sort of a common ground in the House and the Senate where people would get together in the evening for a drink or whatever. And all of that seems to have dissipated.
It has, and I think one of the most dangerous things that I see happening in our politics is the notion. Daniel Patrick Moynihan had a wonderful expression. Apparently he was in a committee hearing and somebody was arguing about some arcane issue with him. And Daniel Patrick Moynihan was a pretty good arguer. So the other guy's getting a little flustered. Finally, the guy says, well, you know, I'm entitled to my own opinion. And Daniel Moynihan says, you're entitled to your own opinion, but you're not entitled to your own facts. All right?
That's a good point, an important point.
And part of what's happened in our political dialogue is the notion that not simply opinions are contestable, but facts are contestable. That we don't have, that there's no way for you and I to sit down and even if we disagree on sort of direction for the country, that we can at least agree that the budget deficit is X amount, or we can agree that climate change appears to really be occurring, right? I mean, we could still have some pretty robust arguments as to whether the marketplace is the best way to deal with climate change, or whether we need some sort of command and control regulation or something in between. But now we're having arguments about whether climate change is happening at all, and experts can be bought and sold and purchased and packaged and in such a way that the American people, I think, oftentimes just don't have a clear sense of what the baseline facts are.
Let me challenge you something on your favorite issue, education,
Right.
and your party, which is deep inside, I suspect, that you feel that No Child Left Behind is a pretty darn good thing. It's a good bill because you need accountability, you need standards, you need to take the money and use that to force the standards, and yet suddenly the Democrats are against that bill, even though they had once helped do it. I don't understand why somebody like yourself can't say, no, we need to keep at least the backbone of No Child Left Behind instead of making even education a partisan issue.
Well, actually, I have said that.
Yeah, well,
So
go ahead.
But I think that I've mentioned this to some people, and I'm still, my views are evolving. But what I can say is this, that the Democratic Party right now does not have an agenda on education that I at least can articulate. I think that there's some areas where Democrats broadly agree, smaller class sizes, early childhood education, some terrific programs that we need to support. But if you ask the average person on the street, what are we doing about our education system? Precisely at a time where if we don't revamp our education system, we will continue to fall further and further behind in global competition. I don't think the average person could give us a good answer. I mean, it'd be interesting to do a poll here and find out, this is a pretty well-educated, unrepresentative group. I think people would have a hard time figuring out what Democrats stand for in education. And so what I've said, at least, is that a couple of basic principles have to be part of the Democratic agenda. A school system in which a third of our students aren't reading at grade level. Only a third of our students are actually being prepared for the sorts of high-wage, high-value jobs of the future is unacceptable. The status quo has to be radically altered. That has to be a basic premise in the Democratic Party platform. And I think that No Child Left Behind was at least a step in a direction of saying that we have a national challenge that has to be met. Now, I think George Bush completely failed to adequately fund these No Child Left Behind. I think there are all sorts of problems in terms of applying standardized tests as the only way of holding schools accountable. Most importantly, No Child Left Behind did not speak to what I think is the most critical issue in education, and that is, how do we encourage our best and brightest to continue teaching? And how do we substantially upgrade the pay and the performance of the teaching profession? And the regard in which it's held. I mean, I'm a relatively young man. I can remember when I was growing up, this is not so long ago, where if somebody told you they were a high school teacher, that was wonderful. I mean, that was a noble calling. And that sense of teaching as a noble calling, I think, is diminished, partly because the pay differentials between teachers and somebody who's an investment banker or a lawyer has widened so dramatically. But part of the trade-off, I think, that we've got to have, and the Democratic Party has to lead this trade-off, part of the trade-off we've got to have is to be able to say to teachers, we will pay you substantially more. And
wait, there's more.
But
I hope there's a but in this sentence.
in exchange, what we're going to have to do is make sure that the rules that govern how our schools work are not impeding innovation and are not blocking strong measures of performance to make sure that our children succeed over the long term. I actually think that's the kind of trade-off that can be accomplished. And I think it's going to be important for Democrats to put forward that kind of proactive agenda and engage the teachers' unions and others who are legitimately concerned about the public schools being starved for dollars into a broader conversation about how we redesign these schools to make sure they're performing for our kids.
Would you be in favor of charter schools that did not have teachers' unions?
I am strongly in favor of charter schools, and have actually, as a state legislator, promoted them in Illinois. I think that innovation is critical, and the schools that work, when you walk into those schools, you know they work. And the reason they work is people who are working there feel a sense of ownership. They feel empowered. There's a sense of mission in the school, and that's hard to generate simply by a set of bureaucratic rules that are put in a binder. A culture has to be built within those schools. So I think charter schools have to be encouraged. By the way, I don't think that having a union is incompatible with innovation, but I think that the union has to be understood as a professional organization that is improving the quality of life for teachers and making sure that we've got strong standards of performance for our students.
What about vouchers?
You know, I am not persuaded on vouchers, and I've had a lot of discussions. I will say this, if I actually thought vouchers would work, then I would be open to them, because particularly in inner city schools, right now the situation in many of these schools is simply unacceptable.
So you're willing to experiment with them to see if they work?
Well, I've seen some of the experiments, and so far I'm skeptical. Part of the problem with a voucher system is similar to the arguments that are being made around health savings accounts or private accounts for in lieu of Social Security. The tendency, I think, is once you privatize a social good, that over time there's a strong urge on the part of people who don't really need the subsidy to say, let's just scrap this thing. And we have an experiment in vouchers in public housing. It's called Section 8. People are given these vouchers. And what's happened is, over the last 15, 20 years, Congress has systematically underfunded vouchers to the point where they are not serving the people that they were intended to serve. And part of what we've always valued in this country has been a public education system that not only opens up economic opportunity, but also creates a common civic culture. It goes back to the point that we were raising earlier. Do we have some common frames of reference that allow us to participate in a deliberative democracy? I think public schools are worth preserving, and I do think that over time a voucher system would ultimately result in public schools that were for those who had the fewest options and were starved for funding, and I think would ultimately result in a worse situation for those who really need public education.
You were pretty brutal in criticizing President Bush after his Iraq speech last week, saying that they hadn't laid out a plan, it hadn't been thought through.
Well, I don't think that's brutal. I think, no, look, I mean, let me say this about Iraq. When I was running, this is back in the fall of 2002, in the run-up to the war, I came out very early, alone among the 7 Democrats who were running in the primary in Illinois, and said this is a bad idea. And I said it was a bad idea not on the basis of ideology. I think that part of the thing that Democrats have to think about is when do we assert our military force intelligently. I think there are occasions where we have to do that. It certainly wasn't because I didn't think Saddam Hussein was a bad guy. I specifically said in a speech in the Plaza in Chicago, this is about 6 months before the war was launched, I said, I'm not on the Senate Intelligence Committee, but I don't see any serious proof of weapons of mass destruction. I don't see a connection between Saddam Hussein and al-Qaeda. This is going to cost us billions of dollars and thousands of lives and will fan the flames of anti-Americanism. And I think I've been pretty restrained in not saying I told you so.
Until now.
Until now, right. But what I also said at the time was once we were in, we would have to figure out how to make it work. And so I, like many Democrats, I think, have showed significant restraint in saying that, the analogy I use is if a bus driver drives a bus into a ditch, you should ask questions as to how it happened, and you might want to fire the bus driver, but you still got to get the bus out of the ditch. And there are only a handful of ways of doing it. There's been a lot of pressure about, well, the Democrats should come up with an alternative strategy. Well, the truth is that there are a limited range of options now available to us in Iraq. And my complaint with the administration is not that it only finds a limited range of options available to it. It's the spin and the lack of forthcomingness that this administration engages in when it talks about Iraq. Look, when it says that there are 160,000 trained Iraqi troops, the only Iraqi troops that are trained that mattered are Iraqi troops that can replace American troops. Their estimate, uniformly, if you ask military intelligence on the ground, how many Iraqi troops are actually trained to replace one-for-one American troops? It's certainly less than 10,000. And yet they throw out a number of 160,000. Now what that does then is it erodes not only their credibility, but it makes it very difficult for me to have a constructive conversation. Again, it goes back to, can we at least agree on a set of facts? Given that we've got difficult choices, given that the American people are sacrificing both in terms of blood and treasure, are we able to agree on a set of facts so that we can move forward in an honest way? And that is where
Okay, but you say there's a range of options. Let me pose...
I said there are a very limited range of options.
Okay, a limited range of options. And on each extreme would be one that says the facts are pretty bad, like you say, and we have to keep our troops there or even put in more troops until we can stabilize Iraq. We have to stabilize Iraq and get the security right so that they can have the government. The other might be called declare victory and go home.
Right.
To say, it's now their problem, we've deposed Saddam Hussein, let them work it out. Which side would you be closer to?
I'm not going to buy into that choice there, Walter. But here's what I do think we can do. I think that we are starting to step up our training of Iraqi troops, but it's still going to take about 1.5 to 2 years before we have any kind of effective security force that can seriously supplant American forces. I think that we can engage the Arab nations, the Arab states in the region much more effectively in asking them how we can proceed and getting them to feel a greater stake in our success in the region. You know, they're offering help that we are not taking, partly because we want to control the situation there in a way that probably over the long term I think is counterproductive. I think we have to continue to press the Shias to make sure that the Sunnis, as much as possible, are included in this Constitution writing process. I suspect that the Constitution will not be completed in 3 weeks. I think it's going to take, that's a wild guess on my
Right.
part. So
Took us longer
Yeah,
back then,
it did.
too, though.
So we're looking at a constitutional writing process that's going to take at least another 7 months. And I do think, and I won't take credit for this, I'll attribute this to Carl Levin, my terrific colleague from Michigan. I think we should send the message that all the parties involved, the Shias, the Kurds, the Sunnis, you guys have to make this work because we're not going to be here forever. And if the Constitution fails, if this process of you finding accommodation fails, then we will consider all options, including the drawing down of troops. The reason I think that that is an effective message to send is because I think there are certain factions in Iraq, particularly the Shias, who like the idea of the Americans standing behind them and may not feel as great a sense of urgency about the need to siphon away some of the antagonism from the Sunnis as long as we're there. And if they felt that they're going to have to take on their own security more rapidly if they're not making those accommodations, then I think that that's a good message to send. The final thing I'll say is this. This administration has been extraordinarily ineffective in its public diplomacy. Some of that is just the substance of its policies. You can't spin what I think were ill-conceived policies. But some of it has also had to do with tone. And in the same way that tone matters in the United States Senate, tone matters in people's day-to-day interactions in your family or your business, tone matters in international affairs. And if our basic tone is one in which we are happy to have the help of other countries as long as they are doing exactly as they're told, then it's hard to imagine that they're going to, over the long term, feel invested in the sort of orderly, secure, and mutually advantageous world system that I think is in our interest.
Is Senator Clinton your party's most likely nominee?
Yes.
Why?
Oh, there's a murmur out in the crowd there. Wow. I think that there are wonderful candidates. Half my colleagues are running for the presidency. But I think what I said is not, it shouldn't come as a surprise. She's by far the best known. She has a terrific infrastructure. She's extraordinarily intelligent and has shown herself to be a very able campaigner. That doesn't mean that she wins the nomination. I think that it's a wide open field both on the Republican and the Democratic side. But if you ask me who would be the most likely candidate, they have these online odds makers who can, you can lay down your bets. Mm-hmm. And I think that she's pretty substantially ahead.
Is she the strongest candidate?
I ranked pretty. I was on there despite the fact that I said I'm not running, and that shows you that they probably don't really know what they're talking about. But
is she the strongest candidate?
You know, it's so hard to say what the situation is going to be a year and a half from now. Let me say this about...
I mean, to win in a general election is my question.
Yeah. Let me say this about the Democratic Party. I think that we can take a lesson from the Republicans in the sense that we seem to be continually looking for the next Messiah. I think it's a bad habit. I think that we're better off thinking about what is an agenda, what is a message that is going to resonate with the American people. And if we do that, then I think that the leadership will emerge that can articulate that agenda in a powerful way. And you know, we've mentioned a couple of things that have to be on that agenda. I think education has to be on that agenda as part of a broader message. How are we grappling with this new global economy in a meaningful way? Right now, we are not doing anything serious to revamp our education system. We're cutting our research and development funding. Our community college system and our higher education system is weakening as opposed to getting stronger as a consequence of disinvestment. How are we thinking about that so that when we talk to a steel worker in Ohio, we can honestly say to that steel worker, your job may not be coming back, but new jobs are going to be created. We're serious about retraining you, and most importantly, we're serious about preparing your child and your grandchild to compete. And we're not going to be able to simply draw a moat around America. The Chinese and Indian and Eastern European young people who have been liberated to enter into the world economy, they rightly should be allowed to compete, and we can compete just as well if we've made the investment. That's something we have to answer. We have to talk about foreign policy in a way that's tough and smart, because my personal view is that the other party has the monopoly on the tough and dumb strategy. I don't think that we... I don't think we can be more bellicose than the Republicans. But I think what we do have an obligation to put forward is a muscular, serious policy that is not simply talking about vague multilateralism for the sake of multilateralism, but is rather laying out a serious agenda for how we create the sort of security structures that we created after World War II and that lasted us through the Cold War. And the third thing that we have to talk about is Democrats have to talk about faith and family and community in ways that embrace diversity and tolerance rather than exclude diversity and tolerance. Which, by the way, means more than just trying to drop a quote from the Bible into your speech. It's got to be, there's got to be a sense of authenticity when we talk about values, and that's something that I welcome having a debate about, because I think we've abandoned the field, and it's been filled by James Dobson and Pat Robertson, but I'm happy to have a dialogue about them. If I look in the Bible, there are a lot more references to doing stuff for the poor than there are about gay marriages. And so we can talk about that sacred text. But if you're not Christian, don't pretend to be, then I would rather have Democrats say, look, I'm a proud secular humanist, but I still have a set of values that I care about, and I'm willing to debate people about what it means to treat people with dignity and respect. And so that conversation, I think, has to take place. If we do those three things, global economy, foreign policy, and faith, family, and values in an intelligent way, then I think not only can we win the presidency, but we can win the House and the Senate.
Why don't we go to the audience for some questions? Yes, stand up at that microphone if you would, sir. Yes, sir, in the white shirt. Will you stand at the microphone? Yeah. Right. Yeah, I was asking you to stand up. Actually, well, yeah, go ahead.
Senator Obama, my name is Ibu Patel. I'm the executive director of an organization called the Interfaith Youth Corps, a fellow Chicagoan. You just talked about faith. I wanted to actually ask you to illuminate that a little bit more for us. The United States is the most religiously devout country in the West and the most religiously diverse country in the world at a time when the faith line is what's causing large quantities of bloodshed.
Right.
I'm wondering if you could talk more about what you think public leadership in America would be around engaging our religious dynamics, and if you think that could have a positive effect on faith dynamics in the rest of the world.
Good question.
Yeah, that was a good question. Now I've got to come up with a really good answer.
Good.
Let me try it this way. I think that some of the most important movements to expand and broaden our democracy have been animated by faith. It was certainly true of abolition. It was true of the civil rights movement. If you think about Dorothy Day and the Christian workers, Catholic workers, across history, there have been wonderful influences when faith enters into the public square and informs and instructs on how we can treat each other with mutual regard. I think that when we get into trouble is when we lose what I consider to be a critical component of my faith, and that is an element of doubt. You know, there's a wonderful saying in Scripture that if you can see what it is that you're hoping for, then it's not hope. And part of what distresses me about our current religious dialogue is people are so certain, so absolute in their views that they will not admit that which they cannot see. They will not admit the possibility that the other person has a perspective that not only should be valued, but may be a different pathway to God or to faith. And so part of what I'm interested in is to try to reintroduce a sense of humility when we talk about faith. Something that Lincoln is wonderfully instructive in this. You know, when you look at Abraham Lincoln and his writings, what's striking is the degree to which he's looking for some sort of divine plan, but doubts his own ability to properly discern it and interpret it. And as a consequence, is able and willing, in fact, feels compelled because of the nature of his faith to try to stand in somebody else's shoes and see through somebody else's eyes. And I think that sense of empathy has to be, that's the only way that I think religious freedom and religious tolerance can coexist, is if there's that sense of empathy that's central, I think, to the American experiment.
That's great.
Thank you.
Over here.
Thank you for being here, Senator. Appreciate it. My name is Tori. I live here in Aspen. My question is there a current national dialogue about election reform, how we are going to engage more of the voting population, and do those that are already elected really even care to have any voter reform?
Well, I think that I care. And I do think that there are a number of my colleagues that care. I would distinguish between a set of factors that you mentioned. I think that the most obvious issue in election reform is just making sure that your ballot is counted. And there have been a number of bills that have been introduced. In fact, Senator Clinton has a bill, John Kerry has a bill, my office is working with a broad coalition of voting rights groups to develop a strategy, just to make sure that the ballot is counted. In some ways, that's actually the simplest problem, although it's also one that involves just, frankly, some partisan resistance. I mean, the Republican Party right now feels that the system as is working pretty well for them. And they control the Senate and the House. And that doesn't mean that all Republicans are trying to impede progress on this. It just means that it's not at the top of their list. But there's a broader issue that actually Walter raised, and that is the cynicism and sense that politics doesn't work that leads people not to participate in our democracy. And I think that involves a broader restructuring around issues like the gerrymandering of congressional districts. This is an area where I actually agree with Arnold Schwarzenegger. I think that in California, he may be advancing it for immediate political advantage, but sometimes people do the right things for the wrong reasons. And I do think it is true that the way our congressional districts are gerrymandered, creating 70% Democratic districts or 70% Republican districts, drawn in such a way that elected officials essentially choose their constituents instead of their constituents choosing the elected officials, is a problem. Now, it's not that simple to solve because we have a voting rights reauthorization coming up. A lot of the members of the Black Caucus in Congress would not have been there had it not been for districts that were drawn as minority districts as a way of making up for racial bloc voting in parts of the South and in some parts of the North as well. So it's not a simple recipe, but I do think...
Wait, let me pin you down.
Sure.
Would you be willing to step back from the voting rights reauthorization in order to tackle the gerrymandering issue?
The voting rights reauthorization is something that has to take place because it's part and parcel of making sure that the vote is counted. But I do think that this broader issue of how districts is drawn should inform the debate surrounding the Voting Rights Act.
Let me go to this gentleman here.
Thank you. I'm Milton Sidley. I wonder if you could please comment about your position on what we do with the deficit, how we finance some of these things that you're talking about, and what, if anything, you anticipate in terms of reducing the deficit and so forth.
You know those tax cuts a lot of you guys got? I mean, let's be honest. You guys were doing okay under Clinton. You really were. And you didn't need those tax cuts, and you weren't even asking for them. And that doesn't solve, I don't mean to be glib, because that doesn't solve the entire problem. But I do think it stops the bleeding. I would not make permanent a host of the tax cuts that George Bush initiated, the estate tax being one of them. I think we could modify the estate tax so that it better accommodates small businesses, family farms, but eliminating entirely, I think, would be a mistake. I don't think that would solve the entire problem, obviously. We've got a structural deficit in Social Security that is not actually our biggest crisis. Why the president decided to spend all his political capital on that is not entirely clear to me. I think that this is a classic example. Ronald Reagan in 1983 got together with Tip O'Neill and figured out some modest tweaking of the system that made the system solvent for an additional 75 years. There's no reason why we couldn't do the same with Social Security. Where we do have an enormous problem, and I don't have a good answer to this, is Medicare and Medicaid and the entire cost of health care that is being borne not only by the private sector but increasingly by the public sector, particularly as companies with large legacy health care costs may start dumping and eliminating their health care plans. That is going to involve a serious bipartisan conversation in which we are serious about reducing costs, and that includes things like medical technology. It includes things that in some cases my party may have been resistant to, like figuring out how to rationalize the tort system in an intelligent way. And it's going to involve us, I think, at some point, rethinking basic health care delivery that involves a host of middlemen that are taking money out of the system. If we don't get control of our health care costs, both in the private and the government sectors, I do not think we can solve our structural deficit problem.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you very much. Yes.
Would you be willing to entertain a dialogue for the Democratic Party to revisit the lack of the doctrine that Reagan abolished, which was the fairness doctrine, which affects our media, which affects the public's right to facts, which you spoke about, that we can barely get an agreement about what the facts are. I believe that it's time to reclaim the fairness doctrine. I think that media, whether it's CNN, Fox, MSNBC, all of the media right now is controlled by groups like the Heritage Foundation, the Republican right, and they have it wired. We don't have media representing two sides any longer. And
That's a good question. Why don't we let the senator answer?
I would like to see the Democratic Party take that on, because until that's taken on, we don't have an American system.
Well, I think it's a wonderful question. I actually thought the fairness doctrine worked pretty well. The erosion and its ultimate, the diminished role that basic concept of equal time has played, I think was a mistake, although I think it would be more difficult to apply in a 500-channel news system or media system than it was when we had 3 big stations, and they were the primary repositories of the news. But I think it should be examined, and I think that how we are regulating media in a way that does not inhibit the independence and freedom of Fox News to say what it wants to say, but also make sure that all voices are heard, is something that we're all going to have to be talking about for quite some time. Let me just say one thing about the media, though. One of the biggest concerns that I have is not just the starkly partisan views of Sean Hannity. I mean, maybe because I don't listen to Sean Hannity, it's not as much of concern to me as in mainstream media, including Walter's former employer, Time, or the New York Times, a lot of sources of information that this room might consider unbiased in some fashion, others might consider biased. There's ironically an unwillingness to assert the truth because the idea is that we have to be objective, and so that objectivity is expressed in terms of the Bush administration today said that there are 160,000 troops trained in Iraq. Barack Obama said that there are fewer than 10,000 troops in Iraq. And then we go on to the next story. As opposed to the reporter saying, and by the way, on this point, the administration appears to be wrong, and Barack Obama might be right. And we could reverse it on other issues. I mean, the point is what I think a lot of reporters consider to be objective reporting now is just to write up the press releases of two sides of an argument instead of doing their own analysis of what is true. And I think that has to do with the culture of the media. And it can't necessarily be legislated.
Good point. Yes, sir.
First of all, Walter, thank you very much for bringing this to Aspen. My name is Richard Jacobs.
We also want to thank the Crowns and many other people who helped bring the senator to
Senator,
Aspen.
thank you very much for being here. You took a little bit of the wind out of the sail of my question because it relates to health care, but if you would, it doesn't rank in your top three issues, but would you be willing to give us or share with us your view on how we might get our arms around this very challenging problem of access and quality of health care in this country?
Let me say this. It actually does rank in my top three issues because I don't think we can be globally competitive as an economy unless we get a handle on our health care costs. I believe that very deeply. So we basically have two problems. We have a problem of cost and we have a problem of access, and those two things are related, obviously. Essentially, people always complain about rationing in the Canadian system, but we, of course, have our own system of rationing. It just works differently. There they have lines, and here we have 45 million people who just don't get health care or get crummy health care or haphazard health care through the emergency care system. So on the cost side, I've mentioned some things that I think can make a difference and we could generate some bipartisan agreement on. Medical technology is a good example. It costs us, in some cases, $25 to process a medical transaction, where it costs less than a penny to clear your check at a bank. And that just has to do with setting up an automated system and a clearinghouse, an infrastructure that's been constructed that there's no equivalent for in the medical system.
So you would push for electronic medical records?
Oh, absolutely. And then there are all kinds of issues of privacy and hackers that we'd have to deal with. But the fact of the matter is that we can't continue to have a paper system, partly because more people die of medical error than of AIDS in this country every year. And the reason for that oftentimes is people just can't read the prescription that's been written by the doctor. Or what's on the clipboard, the nurse can't determine what the doctor's saying, or in some cases, because there's no interconnectivity, one doctor may know that somebody's allergic to a particular antibiotic, and it's not communicated in real time to another doctor. So that's an area where I think we can get some bipartisan agreement. I think we can make some significant progress, as I said, in terms of dealing with medical liability in a way that less defensive medicine is practiced. That doesn't mean, by the way, that I'm in favor of blanket caps, but I think that there are ways of at least moderating the system, and there's some interesting efforts at the state level to do so. John Kerry actually had, although not very many people paid attention to it, I think a smart idea with respect to cost that would have an impact on access, and that was taking out the issue of catastrophic care and dealing with that as part of the Medicare system and allowing employers to offer a premium, offer a plan that provides basic prevention, provides basic care, but may not deal with catastrophic care, which is often the most expensive. The government picking up some of the tab on that would allow us to expand because the premiums would be lower. We'd potentially get more workers who currently don't have health insurance at all, having some health insurance. Over the long term, I think that we're going to end up with a system in which everybody's got some basic care, and if you want specialty care, if you want liposuction, if you want LASIK surgery, you've got to pay for it. It's not covered. And we're going to have to make some difficult decisions as a society, particularly an aging society, about what those things we consider part of basic care are and what those things that we don't consider part of basic care. A classic example is hip replacement surgery. Is that part of basic care? It sure improves quality of life. People may not require it in order to have, live their lives, but it's an important issue in terms of quality of life. And so those debates, I think, are going to be critical.
My predecessor stole my question.
Oh, no.
but I'm not going to give up my spot in the line.
You know, can I just say this? You just expressed, I think, the philosophy of the U.S. Senate, in which
let me phrase it a little bit different. You gave the Democrats a choice of having the big three, and I already forgot the first two, and I don't remember the third one.
well, there you go.
But the fact of the matter is that if you have this great message, and you have to turn it over to the opposition's message machine, it's like if you're in court and you ask the opposing attorney to explain your story. How do we overcome that?
Well, look, can the Democrats do a better job delivering a message? Absolutely. But this may reveal some naivete on my part. And so I offer this with some hesitance. I don't think that the Democrats will be effective simply by trying to mimic what the Republicans have done. First of all, we're not as good at it. You notice, the Swift boat thing comes out, and so we decide, well, we're going to find our own Swift boat thing, and it ends up in this big mess with Dan Rather, and it's really embarrassing. I think that if we express ourselves clearly, concisely, and are willing to take risks and describe what we believe in our guts as a party, then I think we can be successful. Now, that doesn't mean we shouldn't rapidly respond to untruths, and that we don't have to create an infrastructure to get our message out effectively. I think we do. And it would be wonderful if we had a network. So if you happen to have a lot of money, let me talk to you after.
Yes, sir.
Good evening. Thank you for coming, first off. It's refreshing to hear from someone. I know a lot of armchair politicians, and not many people actually affect policy, so it's nice to hear that. My question, I guess, segues with the last one, which it appears that I keep hearing about a very organized conservative machine that is out there that is thinking strategically 20 years into the future, maybe further. And I'd like to have some hope that there's a liberal, if you're going to talk about liberal conservative, foundations and strategy being put into place as well. And if you could comment on that, I'd appreciate it.
Well, I think that there's been some discussion about setting up that kind of infrastructure. I think in some cases it's being done. You've got organizations that have just been set up, like the Center of American Progress, for American Progress, John Podesta, Clinton's former chief of staff. I think they're doing some really interesting work in developing not just reactive messages to what the Bush White House is generating, but some proactive, affirmative plans for how we can actually help ordinary people on issues that they confront. I don't think that we will be catching up to the entire infrastructure that's been set up that the Scaife and the Olins and others have financed for the last 30 years. I don't think that we catch up overnight. On the other hand, I think that when we are clear about who we are as a people and what the Democratic Party should stand for, I think we have a better message. And I think that can make up for some of the disadvantages that we're going to always have, I suspect, in message delivery. Part of the problem for Democrats is, Will Rogers' wonderful saying about, I'm not a member of an organized political party, I'm a Democrat. And it's true. We capture a lot of the diversity in this country. By the way, to the Republicans' credit, I think they recognize that that's a strength of the Democrats, and they're now actively seeking to make inroads in African American communities and Hispanic communities, and that's not something I begrudge them. I think it's a healthy thing for both parties to recognize that.
But isn't that worrisome? I mean, here they are again being proactive.
Well, you're absolutely right. We have to, I think, get our message straight, and then I think we have enough mechanisms for delivery, this being one of them, that if we're putting forward a compelling message, then I think we win. Look, when I ran in Illinois, I ran against 7 candidates. One of them had $30 million to spend. He had $400 million, he spent $30 million of it. Another was the favorite son of the Democratic Party of Illinois, who had the endorsement of all the major labor unions and party leaders around the state. I ended up winning by 30 points. When I ran in the Republican primary, in the general election, rather, there was a lot of skepticism about my ability to get Republican votes. We ended up getting 1 million Republican votes. I was never the wealthiest candidate. I never had the most television or the highest priced consultants, but I do think we had the best message. And I think that's not to diminish the need for setting up this infrastructure, and I think people are thinking about it very seriously. But it does mean that I don't care how you frame things or spin things, how pretty a picture you paint. If you haven't done the hard intellectual work and have something to say, you're not going to win elections.
Yes, sir.
Hi, my name's Jonathan Seamus. I overstayed my welcome on Chicago's South Side and live in Carbondale now. It's been a generation since Shirley Chisholm ran for president and you were just elected to the United States Senate. How do you believe that white privilege will either evolve or dissolve in the 21st century?
Last question to do.
Well, I think, let me try to broaden the question because I think we're running out of time, and this may, Walter, does this need to be the last question? And this is probably a good place to end, because one of the running themes in American life has been a cycle in which we expand opportunity and citizenship and then contract it during difficult times, where we think only about us and them, but then us sort of expands to include more and more people. And race has obviously been at the heart of that. And do I think that we're going to entirely eradicate racism, tribalism in this country? No, because we are imperfect. That's the human condition. Can we continue to make progress so that my children have more opportunity than I had, and my grandchildren have even more opportunities still? I certainly think that's possible. This is probably a good place to end with a story. You say you live in Carbondale. I just mentioned that when I ran for the U.S. Senate, I was not favored. We had less money than a lot of candidates. We had to focus all that money in the Chicago media market, where about 70% of the Democratic Party voters were. So we had to kind of husband our resources. We win by 30 points, much to our surprise as well as everyone else's. And now we realize that we're just naked downstate. I mean, we haven't run any television ads down in St. Louis and the media markets down in those areas. And so the first thing that we decided to do is we have to take a downstate Southern Illinois tour. And Dick Durbin, my senior senator from Illinois, agrees to accompany me on a 19-city, 3-day tour of Southern Illinois. And we went to every town in Southern Illinois. We didn't just go to Carbondale. We went to Caseyville and Edwardsville and Hillsboro and Murfreesboro. We went to every hill and borough and ville in Southern Illinois. And one of the places we visited was a town that I'm sure you are familiar with called Cairo, Illinois. And some of you may recall that Cairo, Illinois was somewhat achieved a certain notoriety as having some of the worst racial problems of any place in the nation, as bad as anything going on in Mississippi or Alabama. And for those of you who don't know Illinois geography, southern Illinois is the South. And during the 60s and 70s, I mean, you had people who remembered lynchings taking place in Cairo. You had cross burnings taking place during that period in Cairo. You had de facto segregated schools. African Americans had very great difficulty getting jobs beyond minimum, menial work. And so Dick Durbin and I decided to go, as we're driving down to Cairo, Illinois, he tells me, the first time I went, Barack, to Cairo was during this period of tumult in the late 60s, early 70s. Dick Durbin was then working for Lieutenant Governor Paul Simon, and Paul Simon had dispatched Dick Durbin to investigate what could be done to improve the racial climate in Cairo, Illinois. So Dick Durbin's 23, 24, young lawyer. He takes the bus down to Cairo, gets picked up by a local resident there, is driven to the motel where he's going to be staying, and as he's about to get out, the driver turns to him and says, "Young man, let me give you a piece of advice." Dick says, "What's that?" He says, "Don't use the telephone in your motel room." And Dick says, "Why not?" He says, "Well, the local switchboard operator is a member of the White Citizens Council and is going to report on everything that you say." And this obviously makes Dick concerned, but he's got a job to do. He checks into the motel, goes up to his room, starts unpacking his bags. Here's a knock on the door. Opens the door, and there is a man standing there just peering at Dick. Mean-looking guy. Doesn't say anything at first. Finally just says, "What the hell are you doing here?" and walks away. And now Dick's really feeling nervous. And so am I, because we're pulling into Cairo as he's telling me the story. So we enter the town and we're winding down some streets. We come around an old courthouse, and suddenly we're at a big parking lot. And there are about 300 people there. And I noticed that on first impression that these are people of an age that they might have been active participants in one way or another in that those racial difficulties that had taken place 30 years earlier. But as I get closer, I notice about a third of them are white, and about a third of them are black, about 2/3 of them are white. And as we approach and enter the parking lot, I look, and they're all wearing these little blue buttons. And they say, "Obama for U.S. Senate." And Dick and I get off the van, and they're smiling and taking pictures and offering autographs and offering us barbecue. And I look at Dick, and he looks at me, and we knew what the other person was thinking. If you had asked Dick Durbin 30 years earlier, son of Lithuanian immigrants, father dies when he's barely out of 5th grade. Mother ultimately had to support him and died early as well. If you had told him that he would be returning as the senior United States Senator from the state of Illinois, and that he'd have in tow a black guy born in Hawaii with a father from Kenya and a mother from Kansas named Barack Obama, and that not only would he be the Democratic nominee, but that the people of Cairo would have a reception like this, he would have said, "This is unimaginable. It's impossible." And yet it was happening. And I think that reminds me of one of my favorite sayings by Dr. King, and a good place to end. Dr. King once said, shortly after the walk over the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and at a time when people were very discouraged about the civil rights movement, he said, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." It bends towards justice. But it doesn't bend on its own. It bends because each of us, in our own small ways, try to bend it in that direction. We put our hand on that arc and we pull it in the direction of justice. And I think that if all of us agree on that basic precept, whether we're Republicans or Democrats, then I think that's the answer to your question.
Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you. All right. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate you guys. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. How are you, Wolf?